McLaren didn't dominate 1985 in the way they did in 1984, but still came through with both titles despite the increasing competition from Lotus, Ferrari and Williams. But McLaren were quick from the get-go, never lost form like Ferrari, and were more reliable than Lotus, at least in Prost's car. Poor Niki Lauda only recorded 3 points finishes all year after having all the mechanical problems. Prost, meanwhile, won his first title in exactly the same way Niki won his third, by doing exactly as much as he needed to do, calmly racking up the points rather than worrying about wins. It'll be interesting to compare his precise, cerebral style with Rosberg's scruff-of-the-neck driving next year. Well, at least Tyrrell were allowed to keep their points this year, so that's a plus. Unfortunately, there weren't nearly as many of them as when their cars were underweight. They were adrift without turbo engines early in the year, struggled to get the hang of them when they did arrive, and were knocked for six by Beloff's tragic death just as things were starting to come together. Poor Martin Brundle finished just outside the points on several occasions, but has still yet to put his first official career point on the board. Ivan Capelli and Philippe Streff seemed able enough deputies in the second car, and Ken Tyrrell has some choices to make for next year. It had been a difficult few years for Williams since the Jones-Reutemann days of 1980 and 81, with only Rosberg's skill and guts bringing in the odd win. But for 1985, the new FW10 chassis really worked with the Honda engine, in a way the FW09 never had, and the combative Mansell brought out the best in Rosberg too. It took until the last few races of the season for all the elements to come together and reliability to become good enough, by which time Rosberg had already made his decision to move on, but Nelson Piquet is a great driver, and the team can go into 1986 with optimism. The Brabham team have spent most of the 80s in a good year, bad year cycle, but broke it this year, though not in the way the team would have liked. The BMW engine remains powerful but mechanically problematic, and the BT54 chassis' tricky handling proved too much for poor François Hinault. Even the more experienced Marc Sierra took most of the season to get to grips with it. Tyres were another issue, with Pirelli rubber proving distinctly second best early on, despite Brabham being the team who'd spent months over the winter pounding round Jack Arapagua and Kyle Army to develop them. Whether Piquet has fallen out with somebody, got fed up with Brabham, or just moved to a bigger payday is unknown at this stage. Their problem now is how to replace a driver that the team has been moulding itself around for several years. Ram had a promising off-season, with the new chassis looking neat in testing and Winkelhock putting up some good times. Alio ran in the top 10 and finished 9th at Rio, and things looked bright. Unfortunately, that was as good as it got. The Hart engine, never the most powerful on the grid, was even more problematic until they sorted out the fuel mix later on in the season. By then, though, Winkelhock had died in an accident, and the wind really seemed to have gone out of Mike Ralph and John McDonald's sails. The pair have been running cars in F1 since 1976, before taking over the March operation in 1983, and all of that time, no Ralph and McDonald car has ever scored a point, the team's all-time best result being Jonathan Palmer's 8th place in Rio last year. If, as seems likely, we have seen the last of Ram as a going concern in F1, it's a shame such dedicated people couldn't find a bit more success. Like Williams, Lotus have come good in 1985 after some years in the doldrums. Ayrton Senna was an instant star, and Peter Waugh will be delighted to have had his big investment returned so soon. If the car had been more reliable, the Brazilian starlet could have won the title in his second year in the sport. Early on, it looked like Senna's pace would inspire Elio De Angelis to up his game to challenge the upstart, but as the season went on, he seemed to drift back into his usual minor points finishing spot. Whatever the truth, his departure to Brabham could be easily seen as being driven away from the team, and he'll be hoping to find a new lease of life in new surroundings at Brabham. Meanwhile, the team have to find a new teammate for Senna. Derek Warwick is still favourite, but there are questions about whether the team have the resources to run two top drivers, or if it would be better to concentrate on Senna and have a capable backup in the other car. Renault, the team who brought turbocharged engines to F1, depart in ignominy just as their use becomes universal. 1984 had been bad enough, with the team outdone by their own customers Lotus, and over the winter, key personnel like Gerard Larousse and Michel Tetu departed, and the RE60 chassis was looking like a dud already. The remaining team did the best they could with what they had, but it seemed obvious from mid-season that corporate HQ was running out of patience, and that the team themselves just didn't know how to fix the problems. By the time the team's withdrawal was officially announced, no one was greatly surprised, and Ligier's good result in Australia, meaning that both main customer teams finished above them in the table, just underlined the decision. Patrick Tambay at least has already found employment at Haas next year, and if there's any justice, Derek Warwick should find a good berth too. Progress for Arrows in 1985, most notably in the reliability stakes, with the Arrows cars often picking up points simply by being still running at the end. Boutsen has handled his transition to team leader in his stride, and while Berger is still prone to the odd gaffe, he's showing himself an able driver. The BMW engine was still the weak point, though the boys from Bavaria are finally getting on top of its reliability problems. The undoubted high point, of course, was Boutsen's second place at Imola, equalling the team's best ever placing scored by Riccardo Patrese in 1981. Sure, it was a result of Prost disqualification, but the team won't care, neither will Thierry, and third would have been quite good enough on its own. Up until 1985, the Tollman story had been one of steady progress, from non-qualifiers to midfield runners to point scorers to podiums with Senna in 1984, and even nearly a win. So it was something of a come-down that this year the team have scored no points, and except for Fabi's pole in Germany, have been generally invisible much of the time. They never seemed to quite get over their late start to the season, and also suffered from the problems of all Pirelli users. Fabi's a decent enough driver, though he's no Senna, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with Benetton now in charge. Will they want more high-profile Italians? If the Renault team went out under a cloud, the other failing manufacturer quietly slunk out the back door with barely a whimper. About the only times they were ever seen on camera was when a driver was climbing out prematurely or hitting something. Cheever put in a couple of good drives early on, but even he seemed to lose heart quickly. That the team reverted to last year's car because the new chassis was so bad tells you a lot about the state of things there, and the announcement a few days after the Australian Grand Prix of the team being wound up came as a surprise to no one. Alfa Romeo will continue supplying engines to Osella, while their two talented drivers will have to hope for better things wherever they end up. Osella seem to have established themselves during 1984 as solid midfield runners, but once again they've slipped back to the rear of the grid as they lack the funds for any kind of development. The Alfa Romeo turbo engine they campaigned for so hard has turned out to be a millstone round their neck, and lest we forget the chassis is still basically a 1983 Alfa Romeo. At least pay driver Hub Rottengatter wasn't a total disaster from mid-season after his wayward outings for Spirit in 1984, and a 7th place in Australia was a decent if somewhat less than tangible reward for a season's hard graft and passion. Ligier are starting to show signs of climbing out of the pit of despair they fell into in the early part of the decade, going from winning races in 1981 to scoring no points in 1983. The arrival of designer Michel Tetou and team manager Gerard Larousse from Renault, and with it the end of some of the politicking that bedeviled the Ligier team, certainly made a big difference, and both drivers put in some decent performances. Andrea de Cesaris' sacking partway through the season actually raised a couple of eyebrows because despite his reputation, he hadn't really had more accidents than anyone else mixing it in midfield, but his replacement Philippe Streff certainly showed a bit more pep. A little too much pep in Australia, to be sure, but with continuity of engines, tyres, personnel, and the totemic Jacques Laffite going into 1986, the team will be looking forward to the new season. Things looked good for Ferrari early on, and even the odd and still unexplained sacking of René Arnoux didn't prove too much of a problem when Stefan Johansson stepped in with aplomb and came within an ace of winning his second race with the team. For the first half of the season they ran the McLarens and the rest close, and there were some fine battles between Prost and Alboreto, notably in Monaco, but after mid-season something went terribly wrong. A new suspension configuration seemed to be the root of some of the problems at least, though the engine also suffered more from its lack of power in the later circuits, and the chassis seemed tricky to set up on all but the smoothest surfaces. A season of frustration, especially for the ever-cheerful drivers, and it remains to be seen if Johansson will be kept on for 1986, or will be just another in the string of Ferrari caretaker drivers. The little Italian team and its avuncular boss won a lot of friends in the paddock. Apparently they make the best espresso in the pit lane if nothing else, but on track they seemed rather amateurish at times. The pit crew occasionally resembled the Keystone Cops, especially early on, while poor Pierluigi Martini seemed completely out of his depth. Things slowly improved as the season wore on, though the Carlo Chitti engine seemed to suffer from a lack of development, and improvement in this case is a relative term, meaning they didn't always qualify last by the end of the season. Still, the first year is always a tough one, ask the boys at Tollman, and they'll be back and looking forward to better in 1986. If Minardi looked chaotic and stereotypically Italian, Eric Zakowski's men looked efficient and stereotypically German. Jonathan Palmer is a rather more experienced driver than Martini, of course, and his credentials include lots of testing experience, which has proved invaluable. Short-notice replacement Christian Danner didn't embarrass himself either, and may prove an attractive option as a German driver in a German team for next year. The team were always open about this being a development year, ready for a full programme next year, and they seem to have a solid base to work from. though the number of failures of their in-house engine must be a concern for them. It's difficult to assess the Haas team on the strength of 4 entries, the whole thing more of an extended test, but the fundamentals seem sound, and Alan Jones went some way to dismissing fears that he was too old, unfit and rusty to return to the sport. The signing up of experienced development driver Patrick Tambay bodes well, and there still seems plenty of money and enthusiasm for the project coming out of Beatrice and Ford. Much will ride for 1986 on the performance of the Detroit firm's much-touted V6 turbo engine.